right, so we're here. Now we're here to talk about these films. So I think you said you want me to begin?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, since I broke into his house, here we go. I guess I'll go first. It just shows you how awful I am. The first pick that I have here is Seven Samurai by Akira Kurosawa from 1954. We have a special relationship with this movie, buddy.
Mm-hmm.
We both watched this at Alamo Draft House. It was a screening that we watched late night.
Mm-hmm.
And man, this was a long one.
Yes. We it was an 8 o'clock screening, which normally does not really sound like too late of a movie, but when it's as long as this one is, it was exhausting, and it was a weekday as well.
Was it a Monday or a Tuesday?
I think it was a Monday or Tuesday. I think
Wow.
It was Tuesday because I remember right before that I had just gotten back from the True False Film Festival in Columbia. And so that was like 3 days of just constantly watching movies, and then to come back to the very next day.
To this epic long film that you're like, any other time period might work, but maybe not right now. Maybe not the right headspace, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was still a good time.
Right. But it's certainly long.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, this movie's great. I definitely selected this movie because we have that relationship together. We watched it.
Mm-hmm.
I think our significant others and friends chickened out because we were going to go and watch it with other people, but it was just us two, and so it was really cool. Yeah, I have recently watched this. I think it was the 110th birthday of Kurosawa.
Oh, okay.
I want to say that was the reason we watched the screening. Also, Toshiro Mifune's birthday was not too long ago, and I actually watched Throne of Blood for the first time.
Really good.
Yeah. But yeah, no, this is a classic. This is the second in the spine number of the collection. So I mean, this is a classic. So I definitely wanted to select this because we both have that association. It's a classic. We have that good time together with it. So enough about Seven Samurai because I'm sure most of you already know about it. And so let's jump right into Palmer's pick. What'd you pick first?
My first pick is Symbiopsychotoxiplasm, and I'm going to talk about Take One, which was made in, I think, 1968. And the reason that I chose this as kind of an overlooked pick is because, it's by William Greaves, and who's heard of William Greaves? It actually, I think, at its original release, I think, and I could be getting some of the details a little bit wrong here, because it's been a while since I've read into it, but I believe it played at a few festivals but wasn't really widely seen, and I think actually William Greaves was pretty embarrassed about a lot of it as well, because he was actually a filmmaker who I believe did kind of social documentaries kind of focused on contemporary black issues in the 60s for like PBS and stuff.
Oh, okay.
And he
sort of like syndicated television programs, right.
And I mean, in that sphere, he was highly regarded. But this is completely different because it's definitely more experimental than that. And it really, what it's about is a documentary where he's the director of the film, and you have him filming all these sets of actors playing a couple, and they're each doing the same scene over and over and over again. And then you have another film crew that's filming the filming of the movie. So it's a bit bizarre, but
right.
I mean, the real objective of the film is to basically see how far the crew is going to go along with it.
Uh-huh.
And it's interesting because it's so his intentions.
Did he tell the crew that he was doing this?
No, they had no idea.
Okay.
And I'll get to that.
Okay.
I'll get to that later too. But it's interesting because for the, I believe his intentions was to make more of a statement about Vietnam and really kind of questioning how far people will go. Obeying authority, essentially.
Right.
But then I know that it's also kind of been taken as this statement kind of arguing against auteur theory, because you have the director who's controlling everything, William Greaves, but then the cast and crew are getting very upset because they're like, listen, yes, you're paying us, but what are we doing here? And I think the most interesting part of this movie is you actually have scenes of the crew who allegedly didn't tell William Greaves about this, but they actually shot themselves. Talking about like, what is William Greaves doing? Let's have a discussion about it, and let's have this discussion about authorship.
Okay.
So it's
like who owns the product
right,
at the end of the day.
Right, and it's interesting too because, you know, the 60s, and you do think about like Breathless, like auteur theory and everything.
Right.
But then at the same time you have like these leftist political movements that are all about like the sense of community.
Yeah, because this is 1968, so this is right around the time of the hippie movement, and also just all the Vietnam and a lot of just like social unrest.
Right.
I would say, like, 'cause Bobby Kennedy got shot a year later or something like that, and you know everything was just going, you know, like just crazy, I guess, in America, especially in America.
Yeah. And
so I guess, you know, seeing that in film is like really fascinating.
Right. But yeah, it's a great film, and like I said, it wasn't seen for like even decades, and I want to say it was either like early 2000s or in the 90s sometime. I want to say it showed again at Sundance, and Steven Soderbergh and Steve Buscemi both saw it, and they were like, why is this not, like, this is an amazing film, why haven't more people seen it?
Yeah.
And then that's why that's how Take 2.5 got made, which I've only seen Take 2.5 once, but in college I watched part 1 like all the time.
Okay.
It's
Take 2.5 came out in 2003.
Yeah, and it's like the same actors, but they kind of like come back for like this.
Oh,
so
okay.
It's interesting, but I feel like, I don't know, the experiment of the first one is just endlessly fascinating for me.
Right.
And it's one of those movies where I feel like every scene is necessary, and yeah, you should check it out. It's not a big time commitment either. It's only like an hour and 10 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, 75 minutes, so about 15. So,
yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up because I've actually been watching, and we talked about it in the past, Abbas Kiarostami. I've been watching his films, and obviously he probably saw some of this work, maybe, and utilized some of that kind of fiction documentary hybrid style. Obviously, they have their own voice, but there might have been some kind of crossover, right?
It's possible. I mean, I don't know what he's seen or hasn't seen, but I know that especially like in the 60s, there were a lot of experiments with blending fiction and nonfiction and kind of like testing those lines, including with the filmmaker that you're going to be talking about. But yeah, it's I don't know. I think it's definitely kind of a tradition that was definitely kind of in full force in the 60s.
Yeah.
But even before, I know you talked about the movie that we're not supposed to talk about, but the one that you will be getting, the Eureka film. But
right, yeah.
But I mean, even going back to like the 20s,
Yeah.
I mean, even Vertov, there was that.
Like the ownership of like the viewer or the director, the person behind the camera, who's actually making who owns the.
Oh, I'm not talking about authorship right now. I'm talking more about this idea of kind of like blending documentary and
fiction.
more fiction narrative elements together.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk. I mean, that's his own episode we can talk about.
That's true.
That. Yeah, so that's cool. I guess that it naturally blends into talking about auteur and auteur theory. Can't talk. We have Godard's Breathless. And so everyone knows what this film is. If you're familiar watching this right now, I'm sure you know Godard. And this is a film that I finally watched for the first time this year, actually. My introduction to Godard was watching Weekend, which is not a great introduction for me. It was actually just like a crash course, pun intended, into experimental French New Wave. And I'm actually very unfamiliar with French New Wave, and that's why I'm very excited, because it's coming out right at the peak announcement of the Agnes Varda box set. Yeah. So speaking of French New Wave, I'm excited to explore that, and also Jacques Demy, More Truffaut, Melville. I'm excited to kind of jump into that a little bit further. Obviously, I've only seen Truffaut's 400 Blows, Weekend, and Breathless. And so I wanted to talk about this because I know that you really love Godard, and kind of just piggybacking on why you were talking about symbiocytotaxiplasm, how to read it. I'm excited to hear that you are my friend who really likes experimental films. Out of all my friends, you definitely have the eye for that, or like I guess that's maybe your cup of tea. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit about this. Now, I was, like I said earlier in the introduction, I was a little cold on Godard, and so I guess I've found out that I like narrative a little bit more so than a lot of these kind of experimental art, freestyle art forms that kind of pushing the boundaries of what a film is, right, and like what a documentary is. So I mentioned Kiarostami earlier, who is another person that stretched it, but it maybe in a more narrative sense, kind of blending. It felt like the Apu trilogy. I can't think of his name.
Ray.
Yeah, Ray. Sajid Ray combining with like maybe somebody who's a little bit more experimental, like Greaves. So like it feels like a weird blend. But obviously these are their own people, and these are auteurs, right? And so what do we have with Breathless, like with auteur? How do you see that connection with what we previously mentioned with Taxiplasm?
Well, the reason that I think it's kind of interesting to have one and then the other is because symbiocytotaxiplasm, like it could be read as sort of an argument against auteur theory, but then with like this film by Jean-Luc Godard, he's actually rejected a lot in years, a lot of auteur theory, like in years after like the 60s, which is pretty interesting. But I think it definitely has, I'm still interested in it for sure, and I think it definitely has its advantages too. I think it's when people first really started thinking of, well, not first, but it really got people thinking of like film as an art form.
Right.
And you see that like pretty explicitly or implicitly, I guess it's really more implicit in this film, like and one of the reasons I love this film is it's, even though there is a narrative to it, it seems like every scene is sort of making some sort of philosophical point about film in a way that's pretty similar to an essay. And the one that I'm thinking about specifically is there's a part where she's interviewing a famous author, but the author is played by, is it Jean-Pierre Melville?
I believe so. It's Melville.
And it's kind of making this statement about equating like literature to art instead of like literature, which is kind of considered, or at least at the time, and still probably to today, considered the finer art, or the art to take more seriously.
Right. It's more serious in music. It's more serious in movies.
Right. By having him play that author, it kind of flattens that hierarchy a little bit.
Oh,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there are just lots of things that
little subtle things that.
Yeah.
I mean, I obviously watching it and talking about it, I know that he's got some of his film history on his sleeves. He's like, kind of showing it, unraveling it, and definitely like altering it to like flatten it on its head and like reverse that hierarchy.
Yeah, it's like a B movie, like a gangster B movie, but then he decided to completely make it his own,
Okay, yeah. So I definitely, with this discussion of this, has definitely made me want to revisit this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm excited to talk more about Breathless someday.
Yeah.
In the future when I revisit it and have a new perspective. So okay, let's move on to what do you got next?
Next, I have Chantal Akerman in the 70s. I absolutely love this set, and I love Chantal Akerman too. And although I know it's overlooked, like I said before, she is considered like a great director because of Jean Dielman, which is, not only one of the most important films to like feminist film studies, but just one of the greatest films of all time. And I think a lot of people would say that. But I think that sometimes I've talked to people about Chantal Akerman, and I feel like, and this isn't true for everybody, because I think she's considered a great director. Sometimes I just get the feeling that like people don't necessarily see how great some of the other films are.
Okay. What we got in there in that box set?
Yeah, so we've got La Chambre, Hotel, and pardon my pardon my French.
Your
Yeah.
French American,
Right.
your English accent.
La Chambre, Hotel Monterey, News from Home, Je tu il elle, or I you him her.
Yeah.
And Les Rendezvous d'Anna. And you know, I think it's kind of interesting. It's sort of like whenever I hear, oh yeah, absolutely. Whenever I hear people, I've heard this before, and I don't know if you've heard people say this, but talking about Citizen Kane, and then they mention how like they, well, you know, every time I see another Orson Welles movie, it just like pales in comparison. And my thought process is just like, no, like this is, I think this is a really unfortunate thing, and I hope that people really try to, because even though I do think Jeanne Dielman is her greatest film, like she did so many other, she has such an interesting body of work.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I really like about her work, and that I think that you definitely see in this particular box set, is showing alienation and isolation through space.
Okay.
In a way that I think, especially in like Les Rendezvous d'Anna, it reminded me a lot of like Antonioni. But I was reading about it, and apparently when it first came out, the critics really hated it. It was after she had made Jeanne Dielman, and Jeanne Dielman was made, I think it was like an 80% female crew. You know, it didn't really have like the biggest budget. This was made with a bigger studio, and
Right.
it did have like a lot of men who were working on the project as well.
This
so
is later in her career. It's 1978.
yeah, but only a few years, you know,
Oh,
because
okay.
that was, I think it's 75 that Jeanne Dielman was.
Okay.
And I think that actually, in my opinion, because I think it's had a bit of a critical reevaluation, but in my opinion, that actually, I'm not trying to like bash auteur theory, which is, it might sound like
that's
that.
the whole theme of the episode.
But not at all. Not at all. But I think that's actually one of the negative consequences of it, is that sometimes it does kind of box filmmakers in.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, I mean, I really
If you're
think
known
that,
for one thing, then you won't really explore.
yeah, but you know, like I do think that like Les Rendezvous d'Anna, like if you like Antonioni, I could see you easily liking that because of the way that she uses space to convey isolation. And I think that you see that in a lot of these movies. And what's particularly interesting about this set for me is you have movies like La Chambre or Hotel Monterey. Hotel Monterey is, you know, much more influenced by the avant-garde. It's a 60-minute film that's taking place inside this hotel, and it's just shots inside the hotel.
Oh.
You'll occasionally see people, but
That's
honest,
not like the focus.
yeah,
No.
it's mainly about the space, and definitely
Right.
influenced by like Michael Snow, for example. So it's interesting because like on one end you have movies like Hotel Monterey that are very much in like an experimental vein, but then you also have like this theme of isolation that you see very clearly in Les Rendezvous d'Anna, you know, and but that one's much more conventional. I also heard people compare it to Bresson, but for me I mean, I feel kind of funny even comparing them to those people because, like,
Right.
personal opinion, like, pretty much any day, if you ask me, you can watch any film from Chantal Akerman or from Antonioni or Bresson.
Uh-huh.
And I like both of those filmmakers, by
Yeah.
the way.
I like
but
Bresson, yeah.
but
it's the one, yeah.
Chantal Akerman, I think, is great. And also, really quickly, I know I'm rambling right now, but if we could also talk about, and again, kind of keeping with that theme of sort of unconventional documentaries, News from Home, I think, is also a really interesting way that she conveys space, because you basically it's a documentary. She's living in New York at the time, and there's narration from her mother, and she's reading the letters that she sent to her daughter Chantal while she's living in New York. But you have like these scenes of like you know, New York, it's pretty busy, but you don't really have anyone talking together. You know, the only talking that you have is the mother narrating her letters. You know,
okay.
so it is a really interesting way to convey kind of like this sense of loneliness in a way that's a little bit unorthodox from what you would normally expect going into see just your run-of-the-mill documentary.
Yeah, I guess just hearing you talk about Akerman, her work, I am very unfamiliar with her work, and so also just the Eclipse series in general, which is a massive. It's because it's DVDs.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the reason why. If anyone watches my show, anyone watches my channel, then they will know that I am a big Blu-ray fan, and that's definitely a big hole for me to try to fix. Right.
And I'm kind of the opposite. I'm okay with just streaming stuff.
Right. But yeah, no, I'm excited to check this out and look more into her work and see what she's done. And I'm a particular big fan of films that really kind of prioritize space and like time, spatial and temporal relations, I suppose. This isn't news, and obviously this is probably not at all related to any of the works that we're talking about, but it made me think of A Ghost Story, which is a more recent film that was made by David Lowery. Did you watch that movie?
I haven't seen it now.
But he really explores relationships in a very more narrative sense, obviously, but definitely explores grief unfold and in that you can feel like the time lapse, and it's definitely definitely plays with those elements. So I'm excited to look more into this.
Yeah.
Nice. All right, now let's get silly. Okay. I'm sure most of you are like, okay, what are they talking about? Why are we talking about French cinema? Why are we talking about Japan when we can actually talk about something that we can understand? We all can understand comedy, right? That's what we're really here for. This is Spinal Tap. Now, obviously, this is the Studio Canal version, and this is Spinal Tap was made in the collection as, I think, both a Laserdisc and as a DVD. I believe as a Laserdisc. I know I've seen the DVD before, but I love this movie.
Yeah. What
do you think of this movie?
I think it's one of the funniest movies of all time.
Right.
Just period. Not even about rock and roll. Just it cracks me up, and I mean, I will say this, even though I know you're a bit more partial to the Criterions, even this DVD has probably one of my very favorite audio commentaries of any movie.
Okay.
Because it's
is it not Reiner with other people?
It's I don't think Reiner's in it, but
okay.
it's the band. The commentary on this is it's all of the band, but they're performing their audio commentary as the band. So.
That's also meta, very into what this is. But yeah, no, this movie has so many great scenes from Stonehenge, coming down from the rafters, and the airport scene, where I've definitely, in a post 9/11 world, you can't pull that off anymore, which is unfortunate because I definitely have thought, maybe one day I could pull this off as a joke. And see if the TSA gets it. But I have a feeling that they would put me on a list. They would say, this is the no-fly guy. Can't do this anymore just because I had a cucumber wrapped in tinfoil down my pants.
And I will say, I'll spoil a little bit of the audio commentary here.
Okay.
Just because even though I haven't watched this commentary probably since high school, it's been a while. One of the funniest lines of it, I think, is during that scene. And you have Harry Shearer, and he's still taking it very seriously, and he says, I think this brings up a great question. Why not trains? Why don't we have the security at trains? Why is it just he's still pretty bitter about it, even all these decades later. So I mean, just a great movie. Yeah,
and I love the story of all the drummers.
Yeah.
And all the stories that they have attached to how each one of them somehow disappears or explodes, spontaneously combusts, if you will. But yeah, no, this was a fun pick. Looking over your collection, there's definitely a lot of other picks that I could have selected, but I really haven't talked about this movie on the camera, and it's one of my favorite films, and it's definitely. I wish it had. Honestly, I do really wish that it was updated in the collection because I know that they did update another Reiner film, Rainer, almost did our fast minute on all of us. They did Princess Bride, which is a really great film as well. I know that's controversial for some people who watch the Criterion Collection and collect those films, but I'm a big fan of his work, and I think he's hilarious, and this deserves an upgrade. And I hope it has that commentary as well that Palmer's been talking about.
Well, I will say you should borrow it because
yeah, this is the Studio Canal, which definitely has its special features.
Yeah. So it's got some funny ones definitely. So it's worth checking out, especially if you think the movie's as funny as you do.
Yeah.
Then I think you'd really get a kick out of that.
Sweet.
So.
All right, last pick. What do we got?
So for my last pick, this is actually this might be the film from Criterion that I return to most. Or I shouldn't say film because it's actually a number of his shorts, but it's a Hollis Frampton Odyssey. And Hollis Frampton, he was another experimental filmmaker. You can see a theme going here. Particularly structural film, and really kind of used the medium to, as opposed to other people like maybe Maya Deren or Brakhage before him, who were using film to maybe express or convey like a specific emotions. I think like with the structural film movement, there's a lot more of an emphasis on like how we feel those things and why we feel those things, and a lot more emphasis on the actual film as like a material, like an object. So sometimes like in these films it'll make you very aware of the actual material of film with like the sprocket holes and just a number of different techniques that are really interesting. But it's probably again it kind of overlooked in the same way that Chantal Akerman is overlooked, like within like this group of films, like Hollis Frampton is very highly regarded. Right, the camera stopped recording a little bit, but
here we go.
Anyway, not everyone's cup of tea, but I think that if you're interested in looking at these films for interesting ways that they convey ideas without narrative, then I think there's a lot of really interesting concepts that he explores. One of the films that I rewatched was Zorn's Lemma, and that's, a lot of people consider that one his masterpiece, but it's an hour-long film, and basically the majority of the film is actually it going through the alphabet, and for each letter there's a still image of basically a sign that he maybe took in New York, and it's just one word on the sign, and the word will be
that alphabet letter.
Yeah. Okay. So A, apple, B, books,
Right.
And then for each 1 second, it will go through that. And it just kind of goes in this rotation for a while, and then every so often, one of the letters will be switched out for a film clip, 1 second of a film clip. And then when it returns, it will always return to that film segment, but then it'll be the next second.
Oh, okay. So like splicing it into the
right.
alphabet with...
Until at the very end of that, you have basically all of these film clips together instead of these images of words. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to explain. And then after that, you have this clip of basically a man and a woman and their dog, and they're walking across this snowy pasture into the horizon. And you have these women who are like also taking each word of like this like 11th century treatise on like form and light, but it's actually like very metaphorical for film. Like it's appropriate when you listen to it, but it's just kind of interesting how they're still doing that 1 second thing, not with the film, but with the women who are going through this treatise word by word. In fact, one of the women, this is just a fun little tidbit, Twilight, which I thought was pretty interesting. She did Moving Out. She's but like more of like kind of a choreographer known for Broadway. Right. So it's kind of weird to think that like in 1970 she was hanging out with Hollis Frampton and doing this weird experimental film. But the reason that it's kind of interesting that it's like an autobiography is because it really does kind of move from language, because he first kind of considered himself like a poet, and then it gradually becomes your focus is redirected at film.
Right.
And the way that it does that, I mean, there's a lot that can be talked about, and I really suggest too that if Hollis Frampton is someone that you're interested in, to check out some of his writings too, where he talks about a lot of these concepts. And I don't think that you need to like read his work in order to
plug.
Yeah, Becca actually just got this for my birthday. I'm really excited.
Nice. On the Camera, Arts, and Consecutive Matters?
Yes, yeah. So this contains a book that he wrote called, a book of essays he wrote called Circles of Confusion. And I've read all of those, but it's long been out of print. But they're all on, all of those essays are on the internet. But then there's some more that are in this copy as well. But he kind of explains his... Anyway, I don't think that it's necessary. I don't think you have to read what he's talking about in order to enjoy it, because like when I first got this in college, I kept on watching it. Like there was something that was interesting about it. I just couldn't really
you couldn't point your finger at it. Like, why do I like this? Why am I interested in this? Exactly.
But I do think that after reading some of the concepts that he's working with and why he's making these choices, it does become a much richer experience and much more interesting.
You appreciate it more.
Yeah. You have more context, and then also I feel like I feel like every time I see it, there's maybe something new or different that I catch.
Oh yeah,
in these
that's
films,
nice.
And and I don't even love all of them, but Zorn's Lemma, and then there's also 3 of the 7 of the Hapax Legomena series, which is really interesting. Nostalgia is probably the film that people talk about most. But anyway, I'm rambling now. It's just a great set, and if you're interested in experimental film, then I would absolutely check this out. It's definitely one of my favorites. Probably the one I return to most. So.
Yeah. Well, this was a great little episode we got.
Yeah.
We sat down. I broke into his apartment, and I took all these Criterions from him. And we just sat here and we talked about each one of them. Hopefully you can check out some of these yourselves. I hope that you have taken some notes down from Palmer. He knows a lot more about film than I do, and so I was really happy to be here. Yeah. So thank you for being part of this. I appreciate you being here, man.
Thanks for breaking in.
Yeah, no problem.
I appreciate you being here.
If you haven't,
in my house.
If you haven't, please hit that subscribe button, hit that notification. Yeah, there's a notification right there. Hit that notification, comment down below what you think, and we'll see you next time. I'm not jonesing around.
See ya.